The alarm did not wait for me to wake up slowly. It tore through my quarters like a scream, red light washing over the walls, and I was on my feet before my mind caught up with my body. 700 lives were on that Doran ship drifting outside our hull, and the counter on my wrist display was already falling past 3 minutes. My name is Daniel Hart, and I was the duty officer on the relief ship Horizon 9 when the call came in. I had trained for this moment for 11 years, ever since I was a boy sitting beside my grandmother, listening to her talk about a sky that once cracked open with silence instead of help. I never thought my first real test would come this fast, or that it would feel this heavy. The bridge was already full of noise when I reached it. Grace Talbot, our pilot, had both hands locked on the controls, her jaw tight, eyes fixed on the shattered hull of the alien vessel ahead of us. Behind her, Peter Doyle was shouting numbers from the sensor station, numbers that meant the Doran ship's remaining oxygen reserve was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. I did not have time to feel afraid. I only had time to act. I dropped into my seat and pulled up the emergency channel, my voice steadier than I expected. I called out to the Doran captain, a being named Senuvai, whose voice came through broken and full of static. Senuvai told me they had 703 souls left, packed into a ship built for half that number, most of them refugees who had already lost everything once. Their hull had been struck by debris while fleeing an attack no one back home had bothered to stop. Their engines were dead, their air was dying, and they were drifting through a system that, by the old rules of the galaxy, belonged to no one who was obligated to help them. I looked at Grace. She looked at me. Neither of us needed to say what we were both thinking. This was the exact kind of moment our grandparents had been denied, and we were not going to let it happen again on our watch. I gave the order to close the distance and prepare for docking, even though our own safety margins screamed against it. Peter warned me that debris was still spinning loose around the wounded ship, sharp fragments of metal tumbling in silence, any one of which could tear through our hull if we moved too close too fast. I told him I understood the risk. I told him to keep tracking it anyway, because slowing down was not an option with a countdown this small. Grace flew us in with a precision that made my chest tighten with pride. She threaded Horizon 9 between two fields of drifting wreckage, her hands never shaking, her breathing calm even as the ship groaned around us from the strain. I watched the distance close on my display, meter by meter, until finally the docking clamps locked with a heavy shudder that rang through the whole vessel. The moment the seal held, I was already moving toward the airlock, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Behind me came Claire Whitmore, our medical lead, her kit already slung over one shoulder, her face calm in the way that only comes from years of preparing for exactly this kind of disaster. The airlock door opened, and the smell hit me first, sharp and metallic, mixed with something like burning wire. Then came the sound, children crying, adults trying to comfort them in a language I did not understand but somehow still felt in my bones, bodies packed into a corridor never meant to hold this many people, faces streaked with fear, eyes turning toward us the moment we stepped through. I raised my hands, palms open, and spoke slowly, letting the universal translator carry my words. I told them we were here to help, that we had ships waiting, that no one was going to be left behind. I do not know if they understood every word, but I think they understood the tone, because for the first time since we arrived, some of the tension in that corridor began to ease. Senuvai found me a moment later, moving through the crowd with the kind of exhausted authority that comes from carrying too many people's survival on your shoulders for too long. Up close, the captain looked smaller than the voice on the radio had suggested, 4 eyes rimmed with something that looked painfully close to human exhaustion. Senuvai asked me, almost in disbelief, why we had come, why a species with no obligation to their kind had risked a ship and a crew for strangers who belonged to no alliance, no treaty, no shared history. I told the truth, because it was the only answer that made sense. I told Senuvai that my people knew what it felt like to be left behind, to watch help pass by because the math did not favor us, because the politics were inconvenient, because somebody decided we were not yet worth the risk. I told Senuvai that we made a promise to ourselves a long time ago that we would never let another species feel that same silence. There was no time to say more, because Peter's voice cut through my earpiece, sharp with new urgency. The Doran ship's hull was buckling faster than expected, stress fractures spreading along a support beam near the far end of the vessel, and if it gave way, the entire section could lose pressure within minutes. I gave the order to accelerate the evacuation, and the corridor turned into a careful storm of motion. Claire directed the injured toward the medical shuttle first, her voice calm even as her hands moved fast, stabilizing wounds, calling out instructions to 2 other medics who had crossed over from Horizon 9 to help. Grace ran point on loading the transport pods, counting heads, making sure no child was separated from a parent in the chaos. I stayed near the failing section, because someone needed to keep eyes on the structure while the evacuation continued, and I was not willing to ask anyone else to take that post. I watched the metal groan and twist, listening to Peter's updates through my earpiece as he tracked the stress readings from the bridge, his voice tightening with every passing minute. A young Doran boy broke away from the line at one point, running back toward a compartment near the failing section, ignoring the shouts of the adults trying to stop him. I caught him before he reached the door, kneeling down to his height, using every ounce of patience I had left. Through halting words and gestures, I understood he was trying to reach something he had left behind, something small, clutched in his memory that mattered more to him than his own safety. I made a decision in that moment that I still think about. I told him to stay with me, and together we moved quickly into the compartment, retrieved a small data drive he had been clutching before the evacuation began, something that held the only recordings his family still had of a home that no longer existed. I got him out before the corridor behind us groaned and sealed itself off from the pressure loss spreading through the ship. His mother met us at the transport pod, pulling him into her arms with a sound that needed no translation. She looked at me over his shoulder, and even without shared words, I understood exactly what she was trying to say. The evacuation continued for another 20 minutes that felt like hours. Grace kept the transport pods cycling in a steady rhythm, ferrying groups across to Horizon 9 and the 2 support ships that had arrived behind us. Claire worked without pause, moving from patient to patient, refusing to rest even as exhaustion crept into her movements. Peter tracked the failing structure with a focus that never wavered, calling out every shift, every new fracture, buying us the seconds we needed to finish the job. When the final group crossed into the airlock, I did one last sweep of the corridors myself, checking every compartment, every alcove, making sure no one had been missed. The ship groaned around me the entire time, a slow and steady warning that our window was closing. I found no one left behind, and when I finally stepped back through the airlock myself, the seal closing behind me, I allowed myself one long breath before turning to help secure the last of the equipment. We disengaged from the Doran vessel with barely enough clearance to spare. Grace pulled Horizon 9 away in a smooth, controlled arc, and through the viewport I watched the abandoned ship drift further behind us, its lights flickering weakly, its structure finally giving way to the pressures it had carried for far too long. There was something both sad and strangely peaceful about watching it go, knowing that everyone who mattered had already left it behind. The following hours blurred together in the quiet, exhausted rhythm of an aftermath. Claire moved through the medical bay checking on every patient personally, refusing to log off duty until she was certain each one was stable. Grace sat in the pilot's chair long after the flight was over, staring out at the stars, the tension of the mission still written across her shoulders. Peter ran diagnostic after diagnostic on the ship, needing the routine of numbers and systems to settle his nerves after everything we had just lived through. I found Sci-Fi near the observation deck later that night, watching the same stars Grace had been watching, the weight of command still heavy in the captain's posture. I sat down beside without a word at first, letting the silence hold for a while before either of us spoke. Sci-Fi finally broke it, voice quieter now, almost private. The captain asked me what happens next, now that 703 lives had been pulled from the edge of loss and placed into the hands of strangers who owed them nothing. I told Sci-Fi the truth again, because it felt like the only fair answer I had left to give. I said that Earth would offer sanctuary, resources, and a place to rebuild, not because it was required, but because we understood loss in a way few other worlds in this galaxy ever had to learn firsthand. I told Sci-Fi that centuries ago, my ancestors had waited for a hand that never came, and that the waiting had changed us forever, not into a bitter people, but into a people determined to become the hand we never received. Sci-Fi was quiet for a long moment, processing that, and then asked a question I had heard variations of many times before, from many different species, across many different missions. The captain asked whether we resented the ones who had abandoned us, whether some part of our kindness was really just proof against them, a message aimed at the powers who once looked away. I thought about that carefully before answering, because it deserved a careful answer. I told Sci-Fi that resentment had certainly lived in us once, in the early years after the crisis that nearly ended us, when the wounds were still raw and the anger still had somewhere to go. But over time, generation after generation, that anger had transformed into something steadier and more useful. It became a promise instead of a grudge. It became the foundation of everything we built afterward, from our ships to our laws to the very culture that sent people like me and Grace and Claire and Peter racing across the stars to answer a distress call that no one required us to answer. Senuvai nodded slowly, and for the first time since we had met, something like relief passed across those 4 eyes. The captain said that the stories told about humanity across other systems rarely captured this part, focusing instead on our strength, our resilience, our stubborn refusal to disappear when the odds said we should have. Senuvai said it was good to see, up close, that the strength had not come at the cost of compassion. I stayed on the observation deck a while longer after Senuvai left to check on the rest of the survivors, watching the stars in silence, thinking about my grandmother, about the stories she used to tell me as a child, about the sky that once cracked open with a threat no one else on this side of the galaxy had thought worth stopping. I thought about the years that followed, the ones I only knew through history recordings and old family stories, the ones where humanity rebuilt itself piece by piece, refusing to let despair become the final chapter of our story. Grace joined me eventually, settling into the seat beside mine with a tired but satisfied smile. She told me the numbers had come back clean, every single person from the Doran ship accounted for, every injury stabilized, every family reunited. She said it was the kind of ending that made every risk during the mission worth it, even the moments when her hands had been shaking beneath the calm exterior she kept for the crew. I admitted to her that I had been afraid too, more afraid than I had let anyone see, especially in those final minutes near the failing section of the Doran ship. She laughed softly and told me that fear was not something we needed to hide from each other, not on a crew like ours, not on a mission like this one. She said the difference between us and the people who once refused to help our ancestors was not that we felt no fear, but that we refused to let fear become an excuse to look away. Claire found us not long after, finally free from the medical bay, her uniform still marked from the long hours of work but her expression lighter than it had been in days. She told us one of the elderly survivors had asked to speak with the crew personally, wanting to offer thanks in person rather than through any formal channel. We agreed to meet him together, walking down to the temporary quarters set up for the survivors, where an old Doran man sat wrapped in a blanket, his 4 eyes tired but bright with something like hope. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, thanking each of us individually for choosing to come when so many others across the galaxy would have simply logged the tragedy and moved on. He said he had lived long enough to remember stories about humanity from before the crisis that nearly destroyed us, stories that painted us as unpredictable, difficult, not yet ready to be trusted with the responsibilities of a wider galaxy. He said it was strange and wonderful to see how far that story had traveled from the truth. I told him, gently, that the old stories were not entirely wrong. We had been unpredictable once, difficult once, unready in many ways for what the wider galaxy expected of civilized worlds. But the crisis that nearly ended us had also taught us something that no amount of comfortable stability ever could have taught, and that lesson had reshaped everything about who we chose to become afterward. He nodded, understanding settling into his tired features, and said that perhaps every species needed a moment like that, a moment where the universe tested exactly how much compassion could survive abandonment. He said most species failed that test, turning inward, growing colder, letting old wounds harden into permanent walls against the rest of the galaxy. He said humanity was rare, precious even, for having walked through that fire and come out the other side more open rather than less. I did not have a perfect answer to that, so I simply thanked him for his kindness and told him he was welcome to stay as long as he needed, that Earth's doors were open to him and every person who had traveled with him. He smiled, a slow and genuine expression that needed no translation, and thanked us again before letting exhaustion finally claim him for the rest he had more than earned. We left him to sleep and made our way back toward the bridge, the 4 of us walking together in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes after surviving something hard together. Peter met us there, having finished his diagnostics, and reported that Horizon 9 was fully stable, all systems functioning well within safe limits, ready for the journey back toward Earth with our new passengers safely aboard. I took one last look at the stars through the main viewport before heading to my quarters, thinking about how strange it was that a crisis meant to break us had instead become the very thing that shaped us into people capable of moments like this one. I thought about the galaxy that once turned its back on us, the silence that answered our pleas for help, the centuries that followed where we built ourselves back up brick by brick, determined never to let that silence define our future. And I thought about the 703 lives now sleeping safely aboard our ships, about the boy who had run back for a data drive that held his family's only memories, about Senuvai watching the stars with something like relief, about the old man who called us rare and precious for choosing kindness after everything we had endured. We did not become saviors because it was easy. We became saviors because it was the opposite of what was once done to us, and because somewhere along the long road back from near destruction, We decided that the pain we carried would never again be allowed to turn into indifference toward someone else's pain. The galaxy left Earth to face its darkest moment alone, certain that we would either perish or emerge too damaged to matter. Instead, we emerged determined, patient, and unwilling to let another species feel the same abandonment we once felt. Centuries later, when the moment came to choose between looking away and reaching out, we did not hesitate. We reached out. We always will. As Horizon 9 turned toward home, carrying its cargo of survivors and secondhand memories, I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me my whole life, something I finally felt in my bones rather than just my mind. The greatest answer to being abandoned is not revenge, and it is not bitterness. It is becoming the very thing you once needed and never received, and offering it freely to anyone else the universe forgets. That is who we are now. That is who we chose to become. And as long as there are ships like Horizon 9, and crews like mine, and captains like Senuvai willing to trust a hand reaching out from a world that was once left to die, that choice will never change.